My business rival tried to sabotage my company's launch, so I sabotaged her marriage instead. I never thought I'd be the type of person to destroy someone's life, but here we are. 3 years ago, I was working alongside this woman at a tech startup downtown. We started as colleagues, maybe even friends, grabbing coffee between meetings and sharing ideas about the industry. She was brilliant, I'll give her that, but there was always this underlying competition between us. We both had similar visions for where the company should go, and management seemed to favor her ideas more often than mine. The breaking point came when I decided to leave and start my own company. I'd been planning it for months, quietly developing my business plan and reaching out to potential investors. I thought I'd been discreet, but apparently not discreet enough. 2 weeks before my official resignation, she cornered me in the break room and made it clear she knew exactly what I was doing. The look in her eyes wasn't congratulatory, it was predatory. I submitted my resignation letter on a Friday morning, feeling a mix of terror and excitement about finally taking the leap. My last day was supposed to be in 2 weeks, giving me time to transition my projects and maintain professional relationships. I spent the weekend celebrating with my partner, finally allowing myself to feel optimistic about the future. Monday morning changed everything when I walked into the office to find my desk cleaned out and security waiting to escort me from the building. Management had decided my resignation was effective immediately. They cited concerns about proprietary information and potential conflicts of interest. I knew this wasn't standard procedure. Other people had given proper notice without issue. As I packed my personal items into a cardboard box, I caught her watching from across the office floor. She wasn't even trying to hide her satisfaction. That's when I realized she'd orchestrated this entire situation. My business rival started spreading lies about my company before I even launched it officially. The real damage became apparent over the following weeks. I'd been building relationships with potential clients and investors for months, and suddenly, those conversations went cold. Meetings were canceled, emails went unanswered, and when I did manage to get someone on the phone, they were polite but distant. It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. She'd been systematically reaching out to everyone in my network, sharing concerns about my reliability and ethics. She positioned herself as a worried former colleague who felt obligated to warn people about my alleged unprofessional behavior. The stories were crafted perfectly, just believable enough to plant seeds of doubt without being so outrageous that people would question their validity. I discovered this through a mutual contact who felt uncomfortable with the situation. He told me she'd called him claiming I'd stolen company resources and violated my non-compete agreement. She'd also suggested that my business plan was actually her idea that I'd somehow appropriated. None of it was true, but the damage was done. In the business world, reputation is everything, and mine was being systematically destroyed. The worst part was how calculated it all felt. She wasn't just being petty or vindictive. This was a strategic campaign designed to eliminate me as competition before I could even enter the market. I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to respond, but every option seemed to make things worse. Fighting back would make me look defensive, and staying silent allowed her narrative to spread unchecked. I found out she had been stealing my ideas and presenting them as her own. While researching my options for legal recourse, I discovered something that made my blood boil. My former colleague, who'd warned me about her reputation campaign, mentioned that she'd been promoted to head of innovation at our old company. Curious about what she was working on, I checked the company's recent press releases and patent filings. What I found there made me physically sick. 3 of my major project concepts, ideas I developed and pitched during my time at the company, were now being implemented under her leadership. The marketing language was almost identical to presentations I'd given months earlier. Product features I'd spent weeks researching and designing were being rolled out as her innovations. She hadn't just sabotaged my new venture, she'd built her career advancement on my work. I dug deeper into the company's internal communications through contacts who still worked there. The picture that emerged was even worse than I'd imagined. She'd been positioning herself as the creative force behind several successful projects, taking credit for work that belonged to multiple team members. My ideas were just part of a larger pattern of intellectual theft that had apparently been going on for years. Armed with this information, I considered my options. I could file complaints with the company's ethics board or pursue legal action for intellectual property theft. But both approaches would be lengthy, expensive, and uncertain. Meanwhile, my own company was struggling to gain traction because of the reputation damage she'd caused. I needed a solution that would be both effective and immediate. Her husband started following me on social media and liking all my posts. About 6 months into my uphill battle to establish credibility for my new company, something strange happened. I noticed a new follower on my professional social media accounts, a man whose profile showed he was married to my former colleague. At first, I thought it was just coincidence or maybe professional curiosity. But then he started liking every single post I shared, often within minutes of publication. His activity wasn't limited to professional content either. He was engaging with my personal posts, photos from networking events, and even casual updates about my daily life. The pattern was consistent and felt increasingly deliberate. I started paying attention to his own social media presence and noticed he was quite active, sharing content about his work in finance and posting photos of his travels with his wife. The timing felt significant. While she was busy trying to destroy my professional reputation, her husband was showing unusual interest in my online presence. I began to wonder if this was another form of surveillance, maybe gathering information to use against me somehow. But as I looked more closely at his engagement patterns, I started to suspect something entirely different was happening. He wasn't just following my business updates, he was clearly attracted to me. His likes were accompanied by occasional comments that walked the line between professional networking and personal interest. He'd respond to my posts about industry conferences by mentioning he'd be attending the same events. When I shared photos from business dinners, he'd comment about the restaurants being his favorites too. The attention felt flattering and concerning in equal measure. I discovered he was unhappy in his marriage and looking for someone to talk to. The breakthrough came at a networking event downtown. I was there trying to rebuild my professional connections when I spotted him across the room. He approached me during the cocktail hour, introducing himself as if we'd never interacted online. We talked for nearly an hour about industry trends, mutual connections, and business challenges. He was charming, articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in my company's mission. As the conversation deepened, he began sharing more personal details about his life. He mentioned feeling isolated in his marriage, describing his wife as someone who'd become increasingly focused on her career at the expense of their relationship. He talked about how they rarely spent quality time together anymore, how she seemed more interested in professional advancement than personal connection. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was the husband of the woman who'd been systematically destroying my career, and he was essentially confirming that her obsession with professional success was damaging other areas of her life. He seemed lonely and hungry for meaningful conversation with someone who understood the pressures of building a business. Over the following weeks, our interactions became more frequent and personal. He'd send direct messages asking for advice about his own career decisions, then gradually shift to discussing his marriage problems. I found myself in the strange position of becoming his confidant while simultaneously being his wife's professional enemy. The situation felt like it could be useful, but I hadn't yet decided how to proceed. He started asking to meet me for coffee and complained about feeling neglected. The messages became increasingly intimate over time. He'd text me late at night, clearly after his wife had gone to sleep, sharing his frustrations about feeling unappreciated and ignored. He talked about how successful his wife had become, but how that success had come at the cost of their emotional connection. He felt like he was married to a stranger who only cared about her next promotion or business deal. I realized I was sitting on a goldmine of information about my rival's personal life. Her husband was essentially giving me a roadmap to her vulnerabilities and insecurities. But more than that, he was showing me exactly how I could hurt her in the most personal way possible. The woman who tried to destroy my professional life was apparently failing at maintaining her personal relationships. When he suggested we meet for coffee to discuss his situation more privately, I agreed. Part of me was curious about what else he might reveal, but another part was already forming a plan. If she wanted to play dirty by sabotaging my business, maybe it was time to show her what real consequences looked like. I chose a small cafe across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone from our professional circles. The coffee meeting confirmed everything I'd suspected. He was genuinely unhappy, feeling emotionally neglected and undervalued in his marriage. He talked about how his wife had become increasingly cold and distant, treating their relationship like another business transaction to be managed efficiently. He seemed desperate for someone to listen to him, to make him feel valued and understood. I found myself in a position to give her a taste of her own medicine. As our conversations continued, I began to see an opportunity for the kind of poetic justice I'd been craving. This woman had systematically destroyed my professional reputation by spreading lies and stealing my ideas. She'd built her success on my work while simultaneously ensuring I couldn't compete with her. The traditional routes of fighting back legal action, ethics complaints, public confrontation, all seemed inadequate compared to the damage she'd caused. But here was her husband, clearly attracted to me and increasingly dissatisfied with his marriage. He was volunteering information about their relationship problems, their communication issues, and her workaholic tendencies. He was also making it clear that he found me interesting, intelligent, and emotionally available in ways his wife apparently wasn't. The possibility of turning her personal life into the same kind of battlefield she'd made of my professional life felt like perfect symmetry. I started being more responsive to his messages, more engaging in our conversations. I'd ask follow-up questions about his feelings, validate his frustrations, and share just enough about my own life to keep him interested. I was careful to maintain plausible deniability. Everything I did could be interpreted as friendly support for someone going through a difficult time. But the underlying dynamic was becoming increasingly obvious to both of us. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the foundation was being laid. I was positioning myself as everything his wife apparently wasn't: attentive, emotionally available, interested in him as a person, rather than just a professional asset. I was giving him the kind of attention and validation he clearly craved, while simultaneously gathering information about my rival's personal vulnerabilities. He confessed he had feelings for me and wanted to leave his wife. The moment I'd been both expecting and dreading came during a lunch meeting 3 months after our first coffee. He'd been growing bolder in his communications, more explicit about his dissatisfaction with his marriage and his attraction to me. I'd been walking a careful line, providing just enough encouragement to keep him interested without crossing any clear boundaries that could be used against me later. But that afternoon, he laid all his cards on the table. He told me he'd been thinking about me constantly, that our conversations had shown him what he'd been missing in his marriage. He said he'd realized he'd settled for a relationship that was more like a business partnership than a real emotional connection. He wanted to know if I felt the same way about him, if there was potential for something more between us. I pretended to be surprised by his confession, but I'd been preparing for this moment. I told him I'd felt a connection too, but that the situation was complicated given his marital status. I suggested we should be careful about how we proceeded, that neither of us wanted to hurt anyone unnecessarily. This response seemed to confirm his hopes, while also making me appear thoughtful and ethical. Over the following weeks, he became increasingly determined to leave his wife. He talked about how our relationship had shown him what he'd been missing, how he couldn't go back to pretending to be happy in a marriage that felt emotionally empty. He started making concrete plans, consulting with lawyers about divorce proceedings, looking for his own apartment, figuring out how to separate their finances. The perfect revenge was finally within my reach as their marriage began to crumble. I watched with satisfaction as the woman who tried to destroy my life began to experience her own personal crisis. Her husband started staying out later, being less available for her work events, and generally becoming more distant. According to him, she was initially too busy to notice the changes, but eventually, she began asking questions about his behavior. The irony was delicious. She'd been so focused on sabotaging my professional life that she'd completely neglected her personal relationships. Now she was discovering that success built on other people's destruction comes with its own costs. Her husband was slipping away, and she was apparently too self-absorbed to understand why or how to fix it. He kept me updated on their increasingly frequent arguments, her growing suspicion about his activities, and her desperate attempts to salvage their relationship once she realized what was happening. She'd apparently started trying to spend more time with him, suggesting date nights and weekend trips that he was no longer interested in. The attention she should have been giving him all along was too little, too late. The best part was that she had no idea I was involved. To her, this was probably just the natural consequence of her workaholic tendencies and neglect of her marriage. She couldn't trace this personal disaster back to her professional sabotage of my company. She was experiencing the same feeling of helplessness I'd felt when my business relationships were being systematically destroyed. Except she didn't even know who was responsible. I'd achieved something more satisfying than any legal victory or professional vindication could have provided. I'd shown her that actions have consequences, that trying to destroy someone else's life can result in the destruction of your own. While she'd been busy stealing my ideas and spreading lies about my character, I'd been quietly dismantling the foundation of her personal happiness. As their marriage finally collapsed completely, I realized I'd gotten exactly the revenge I'd been craving. She'd learned what it felt like to have something important taken away by someone who understood how to play the game better than she did. The woman who tried to sabotage my company's launch had ended up sabotaging herself, and I'd barely had to lift a finger to make it happen.